We'll take a real quick break from ancient Greek history to talk about ancient Greek culture, and we'll begin with their religion. So, as we've discussed in class a couple of times, they were polytheistic, that is, that they believed in many gods, some of which you see at the top there, and you're probably familiar with just through living your lives. You had Zeus, you had Poseidon, Aphrodite. The different gods represented different aspects of human life. And what was significant and interesting about them is they weren't particularly moral. They would do, bad things. They would harm one another. And it wasn't in the gods' interest to, show humans the moral way to live. It was, according to the ancient Greek religion, the human's job to please the gods, to keep the gods happy. Because if the gods got mad, they caused natural disasters. And that's where bad things came from. Bad things came from the gods getting upset. So you had to do whatever you had to do, make whatever sacrifices you had to make or whatever to keep the gods happy. That's how they understood the, metaphysical world. The ancient Greeks also essentially invented the modern theater. For fun, they would go to theaters like the one that you see up in this picture here, big open-air type things, and they would listen to, the actors put on a show, put on plays, and those plays would either be tragedies or comedies. Tragedies were serious plays about heroes who very often came to tragic ends. Very often bad things would happen to the heroes, some sort of bad choices or pride or who knows what, depends on the play, would cause bad things to happen to the hero, and other people oftentimes had a lot of the characters die. Comedies, on the other hand, are just like comedies now, right? Lighthearted plays, they make you laugh. They're often used to sort of criticize some part about society, some thing that everyone believes that really they shouldn't, or something. Again, it sort of depends on the comedy. I think you probably understand the difference. Intrinsically, you probably understand the difference between tragedies and comedies. But it's worth noting that distinction in art goes all the way back to this time. Now, last but not least, we've got Greek philosophy. What is philosophy? Essentially, in a nutshell, it just means sort of an organized system of thought. We've got three ancient Greek philosophers we're going to touch on. They're the big three, and we'll do them in chronological order. So the first one up we've got is Socrates. He was famous for, among other things, was a real famous guy, the Socratic method. So Socrates was a teacher, and one of his primary tools for teaching was using the Socratic method. And that just meant that he would ask his students questions rather than, lecture at them like I'm doing with you here right now. Rather than, proclaim what he thought was the most important, he would ask them questions, ask them guiding questions, and lead them to discover their own insights. So his leading through questioning became, a super famous thing that, teachers even do to this day. A famous quote that we just picked out from him is, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And essentially what he's saying with that quote is he wants you to really think deeply and critically about, everything in your life. That your life ought to be examined. You ought to think about everything you do and, really just, everything that you can. You shouldn't do anything thoughtlessly. You should be, everything should be sort of mindful and well thought out. He thought that thinking about everything was really, really important. And Socrates was executed. He lived after the Peloponnesian War. So he lived in a time after Athens had been defeated by Sparta. Athens still exists. It's still an important city, but it's not the flourishing, awesome democracy that it once was. And the leaders are sort of nasty at this point. They don't like Socrates. They don't like how he encourages, questioning and pesky, independent-minded thought. And so he is executed by the government. Plato is one of the students of Socrates. Socrates was his teacher. He had many, many students. Plato was one of them. And actually, everything we know about Socrates, we get from Plato. Socrates didn't, write books. He just taught people. But Plato wrote books, and Plato wrote a lot of books about Socrates. So we know about Socrates from, Plato telling us about him. We know that Socrates existed from other sources, but again, where we get most of our words, like the quote that I read to you earlier, are delivered to us from Plato. Plato said, hey, my teacher taught me this. So he's a student of Socrates, but he was a great philosopher in his own right, and to give an unfair summation of it, he argued that, he wrote a lot about government, and he argued that the best form of government would be one ruled by philosopher kings. And again, to sort of unfairly summarize his complicated views, essentially what he's saying here is that philosophers like himself, deep thinkers, eggheads, really brainy sort of people should be in charge. He wasn't a huge fan of democracy because he thought that allowed, dumb people to be in charge. And he didn't want dumb people to be in charge. He wanted smart people to be in charge. So he advocated for this rule by, philosopher kings. And again, it's more complicated than that, but, that can be your nutshell on it. And then he also wrote a lot about the nature of reality. And again, we're getting into real philosophical stuff. But he argued that there's more to the world than we can perceive with our senses. So there's more going on in the world than just what you can see and feel and touch. He thought that there was, more to it, that there were deeper things than that. Last but not least, we've got Aristotle. Aristotle is a student of Plato, so he's, the next guy up. And Aristotle also had a famous student, but his student doesn't go into philosophy. He taught Alexander the Great, who's going to be this fantastic conqueror, this big-time political leader. Aristotle was his teacher. So Aristotle's student doesn't become a philosopher. He becomes this big conqueror. But Aristotle was, again, very important, very dynamic guy in that he thought about all sorts of different things. What can distinguish him for you from the others is that he was probably the father of the scientific method. He wrote a lot on government, just like Plato did. He certainly thought a lot about, deep mysteries of the universe, but he was also very interested in science and, just sort of how things worked and observations and, testing a hypothesis and all that kind of stuff. He kind of got that train going. So back then, there wasn't as sharp a distinction between science and, the humanities, sort of language arts and, political science and, all of your sort of classes that you guys take now were all sort of merged because they were just kind of figuring everything out. And Aristotle was brilliant on all of it. That's what made him so interesting. He was brilliant on every single level and very interested and very important to the development of the scientific method.